The silver star medal box in my hand felt heavier than any rifle I'd ever carried. 3 months from now, I would stand at attention while a 4-star general called me one of the finest officers he'd ever served with. But right now, in this moment, I was standing in my mother's kitchen doorway, still in my travel clothes, watching her set the table for a dinner I didn't know about yet. A dinner that would end with her introducing me in front of strangers as the family's biggest disappointment. I didn't know it yet, but I would remember every second of what came next. My mother always said I was the family's biggest disappointment. She never yelled it. She never even raised her voice. She said it the way other mothers might comment on the weather, light, offhand, devastating in its casualness. I heard it for the first time when I was 19 and had just enlisted instead of accepting the sorority scholarship she'd arranged through a family friend. I heard it again at 23. When I chose officer candidate school over the wedding date she'd already picked out for me with a man I'd met twice. And I heard some version of it every single time I came home, which over the last 12 years had not been often. This time I'd been gone 18 months. Strategic intelligence work, the kind that doesn't come with postcards or phone calls home. The kind where your mother doesn't know if you're in a briefing room in Virginia or somewhere she couldn't find on a map, somewhere with heat that cracks the ground, and nights so quiet you can hear your own pulse. I'd spent those 18 months learning to read silence the way other people read newspapers. I'd learned to sleep in 4-hour intervals. I'd learned that fear, real fear, doesn't feel like the movies. It feels like stillness, like your whole body turning to glass. None of that mattered when I walked through the front door of the house I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, with its white columns and its manicured hedges, trimmed into shapes my mother found respectable. She was in the kitchen, already dressed for the evening in pearls and a cream-colored blouse, arranging place cards at the dining table like she was staging a photograph. She glanced up at me, taking in my duffel bag, my travel-worn face, the fact that I hadn't called ahead. "Olivia," she said, not a question, not a greeting exactly, just my name delivered like a small correction. "Hi, Mom." She came around the table and hugged me briefly, the kind of hug that doesn't quite make contact, her hands barely touching my shoulder blades before she was already pulling back to look at me, properly assessing. "You've lost weight. And your hair, Olivia. We have people coming at 7. That was it. No questions about where I'd been, no questions about whether I was safe, whether I'd eaten, whether the 18 months had cost me anything. Just the dinner, always the dinner, the event, the appearance that needed managing. I set my bag down by the stairs and looked around the house. Nothing had changed. The same photographs on the mantel, my father gone 11 years now, smiling in a suit at some function I couldn't place. My sister Emily's high school graduation portrait angled just so, catching the light. There was no photograph of me in uniform. There never had been. "Who's coming tonight?" I asked. My mother's face did something complicated then, a kind of suppressed excitement she couldn't fully contain. "The Harringtons, Robert's parents, General Harrington and his wife Diane." She said the word general the way some people say the names of expensive wines, letting it sit on her tongue. "Robert asked Emily to marry him last month. You would know that if you called more." I let that pass. Emily was 28, 6 years younger than me, and I loved her in the uncomplicated way you love someone you've spent your whole life trying to shield from the parts of the family that hurt. "That's wonderful," I said, and meant it. "It is wonderful. Samuel Harrington is a 4-star general, Olivia. Do you understand what that means for this family? For Emily's future." She was already moving again, adjusting a centerpiece, smoothing a tablecloth that didn't need smoothing. "I need you to understand something about tonight. This is important. This is the kind of dinner that matters. I understand dinners that matter, Mom." I said it quietly. She didn't catch the edge in it or chose not to. "Then you'll wear something appropriate. Not..." She gestured vaguely at me at the space where my uniform would have been if I'd worn it home. "Not anything from work. And Olivia." She turned to face me fully now, her eyes sharp in a way I recognized from childhood, the look that preceded every instruction I was expected to absorb without argument. "Don't embarrass your sister tonight. His father is a 4-star general. Please just try to keep the conversation light. Try not to make it about all that. All that. 18 months. A war zone. A life spent standing between danger and the people who never had to think about it. reduced to 2 words waved away like smoke. I didn't answer her. I picked up my bag and walked upstairs to the room that had been mine before it became a guest room, before it became a place with someone else's decorative pillows and someone else's idea of who I should have grown into. I set my bag on the bed and caught my reflection in the mirror above the dresser, a woman who had led soldiers through checkpoints in the dark, who had made decisions that saved lives and decisions that still visited her at 3 a.m, who had earned rank and respect in rooms most people never entered. In my mother's eyes, none of it existed. In my mother's eyes, I was still the girl who chose the wrong path, who embarrassed the family who needed managing before company arrived. I looked at myself a long moment and something in my chest went very still and very quiet the way it used to before a mission. I didn't know yet what the evening held. I only knew that something in me had already stopped bending. The dress my mother laid out on my bed was pale blue, modest, the kind of thing that photographs well and says nothing about the person wearing it. I put it on because arguing wasn't worth the energy I didn't have, and because some part of me, even now, still wanted to give her one evening without friction. I stood at the top of the stairs at 6:50, listening to the doorbell, listening to my mother's voice shift into the register she used for company, brighter, softer, full of little musical laughs that never appeared when it was just us. "Samuel, Diane, you look wonderful, come in, come in." I came down the stairs slowly. The dining room had been transformed in the hour since I'd seen it last. My mother had brought out the silver she only used twice a year, the good crystal, a bottle of wine that had probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget overseas. Candles flickered along the center of the table, their light catching on polished forks, arranged with military precision, an irony she would never have appreciated. General Samuel Harrington stood near the fireplace in a dark suit, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with the particular stillness of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. His wife Diane was elegant in the effortless way of someone who'd spent decades attending functions like this one. And there was Emily, radiant, nervous, standing close to Robert Harrington. Tall, polite, clearly a little intimidated by his own father, the way sons of powerful men sometimes are. "Olivia," my mother said, guiding me forward with a hand at my back, her voice pitched for the room. "Come meet everyone." I shook hands, offered pleasant nothings, took my seat where indicated. The conversation moved the way these conversations always did. Weather, real estate, Emily and Robert's wedding venue, a story about the Harrington summer house on the eastern shore. I ate my salad and answered when spoken to, and watched my mother perform the version of herself she saved for people she wanted something from. It was over the second course, somewhere between the roasted chicken and the wine refill, that she did it. "And this is my daughter, Olivia," she said, gesturing toward me with her glass, already faintly flushed from the wine, addressing General Harrington, directly now, her smile bright and practiced. "My oldest? She tried the military for a while, actually. Quite a phase." A small laugh, the kind meant to invite others to laugh along. "Honestly, she's been our biggest disappointment, bless her heart. We keep hoping she'll figure out what she wants to do." The table went through its expected motions. A polite ripple of laughter from someone near the end of the table who didn't know any better. Diane Harrington's eyes flicked toward me with something like discomfort. Emily's face went, her fork stopping halfway to her mouth, her eyes dropping to her plate like she could disappear into the tablecloth. Robert stared very hard at his glass. I sat perfectly still. I have been trained to control my breathing under conditions most people can't imagine. Incoming fire silence, that means danger, the particular terror of waiting. I use that training now. I counted my inhale. I counted my exhale. I did not let my face move. And then General Harrington set down his fork. He didn't do it loudly. He simply set it down deliberately, the sound of metal against china cutting cleanly through the room's remaining chatter. He looked at my mother first, something unreadable crossing his face. And then he turned and he looked at me. Really looked the way you look at someone you're placing, someone whose name you're matching to a memory. The silence that followed had weight. I felt it settle over the table like a held breath. "Ma'am," he said. And his voice had changed entirely. No longer the polite dinner guest voice, but something lower, steadier. The voice of a man who has given orders that mattered. "It's good to see you again." My mother's wine glass tilted in her hand. A few drops spilled onto the white tablecloth, spreading into a small dark bloom she didn't seem to notice. I'm sorry, General, have you two met? Her voice had lost its polish. She was looking between us, confusion and something like dawning alarm moving across her face. Harrington didn't answer her right away. He was still looking at me, and there was something in his expression I hadn't expected, respect, unmistakable, the kind that doesn't get handed out at dinner parties. Met is one word for it, he said finally, and the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more complicated than that. Lieutenant Colonel Bennett saved my life, and the lives of 11 other officers under my command. About 7 years ago now, I believe. Syria. He said the word like it belonged in this dining room, like it wasn't something my mother had spent years pretending didn't exist inside her own house. Emily's fork clattered against her plate. Diane Harrington's hand rose slowly to her collarbone. Robert looked at me now with an expression I could only describe as reassessment. The look of someone realizing they'd been sitting next to a stranger the entire meal. My mother opened her mouth, nothing came out. I set my napkin down beside my plate very slowly, very deliberately, and I let the silence stretch a beat longer than was comfortable. Somewhere behind my ribs, something that had been coiled tight for 12 years, loosened just slightly, just enough for me to breathe. "It's good to see you too, General," I said, and my voice came out steady, low-controlled, the voice I used to give orders in rooms far more dangerous than this one. "It's been a long time." The candles flickered. No one at the table moved. My mother sat frozen at the head of her own table, her carefully constructed evening cracking open in real time, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I did not feel the need to make it easier for her. The dining room stayed silent for what felt like a long time, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. My mother recovered first, the way she always did, reaching for damage control the way other people reach for a fire extinguisher. "Well," she said with a laugh that came out too high, "isn't that a small world? General Harrington, you must be thinking of someone else. Surely Olivia's never mentioned Patricia." Harrington's voice wasn't unkind, but it carried the particular finality of a man who has spent 30 years being obeyed. I don't forget the people who pull me out of a burning vehicle. The table went quieter still, if that was possible. Diane Harrington's hand had not left her collarbone. Emily was staring at me now with an expression I hadn't seen on my sister's face before. Not embarrassment anymore, but something closer to wonder, like she was meeting me for the first time. I hadn't planned to tell this story. I'd spent 7 years making sure almost no one did. It was a routine security detail that went wrong. I said, keeping my voice level, offering the facts the way I'd offer a briefing, clean, unembellished, no more than necessary. General Harrington's convoy was ambushed outside Damascus. My team was nearby. We got everyone out. I didn't mention the 26 hours that followed the 2 men from my unit who didn't walk away from that night, the year I spent afterward, learning how to sleep again. Some things don't belong at a dinner table, no matter how much a general wants to press the point. But Harrington wasn't finished. He leaned back slightly in his chair, and something in his posture shifted. Not the polished dinner guest anymore, but a man revisiting a memory that clearly still sat close to the surface. She's leaving out the part where she went back into the vehicle for my communications officer after everyone told her it wasn't survivable. She's leaving out that she refused a Bronze Star because accepting it publicly would have compromised an ongoing operation. She's leaving out that the Pentagon tried to pull her into a desk position 18 months ago, and she turned it down flat to go back into the field. He looked at my mother now, and his tone, while still measured, carried an edge I doubted she'd ever heard directed at her before. "I'm not sure what version of your daughter you think you know, Patricia, but the woman who saved my life is one of the finest officers I have ever had the privilege of serving alongside." Thus, my mother's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. She set her wine glass down with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "We're very proud of Olivia. Of course, I only meant—" "Lieutenant Colonel Bennett," Harrington said, and he used my rank deliberately now, letting it land in the room like a correction to everything that had been said before it. That's her title, in case it hasn't come up. It should have come up before tonight, frankly. I find that curious. I watched my mother search for a way out of the moment and find none. Emily had gone very still beside Robert, her eyes moving between our mother and me with the dawning recognition of someone recalculating 28 years of family history in real time. Robert, to his credit, said nothing, understanding perhaps better than anyone at the table that this wasn't his moment to fill. "I didn't know," Emily said quietly to no one in particular, or maybe to me. "Olivia, I didn't know any of that. It's not something I talk about," I said, and it was true, though it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I'd stopped talking about it years ago because the one audience that mattered most had never asked. Diane Harrington leaned toward me from across the table, her voice gentle in a way that felt like the first genuinely warm thing anyone besides my sister had offered me all evening. "Thank you," she said simply, "for what you did for my husband." I don't think I've ever properly said that to the person responsible. "You don't need to, ma'am. I was doing my job." "You were doing considerably more than your job," Harrington said, "and we both know it." My mother made one more attempt to steer the evening back onto familiar ground, reaching for the bread basket, offering more wine, asking Diane a question about the wedding flowers with a brightness that had curdled into something brittle. But the dinner had already changed shape, and everyone at the table knew it. The story of who I was had just been rewritten in front of 5 witnesses, and my mother could not unwrite it no matter how quickly she changed the subject. Near the end of the meal, as the plates were being cleared, my mother turned to me. Her voice was lower now, meant only for me, though I doubted it stayed private. "Olivia, I didn't realize. You should have told me." I looked at her for a long moment. 12 years of missed calls, skipped ceremonies, a framed photograph of my father on the mantel, and none of me. 12 years of being introduced when I was mentioned at all as a phase, a disappointment, a thing to be managed. "I tried, Mom," I said quietly, evenly, no heat in it, only fact. "For a long time I tried, you just weren't asking." She had no answer for that. I offered her a small, controlled smile, not cruel, not forgiving either, just steady, and reached for my water glass. "It's fine, Mom," I said. "I'm used to it." The words landed harder than I intended, or maybe exactly as hard as I intended. Either way, they sat in the silence at that beautiful table among the silver and the crystal, and the wine stain still spreading faintly across white linen, and nobody at the table tried to argue with them. The Harringtons left a little after 10. My mother walked them to the door with the same bright hostess voice she'd used all evening, though it had gone thin and papery by then, stretched over something close to panic. I heard General Harrington pause on the porch, heard him say something quiet to Diane that I couldn't make out, and I heard the particular weight of his silence when he shook my hand goodbye, a silence that said more than most people's speeches. Then the door closed, and it was just the 3 of us in the house, my mother, Emily, and me standing in the wreckage of a dinner that hadn't gone the way she'd planned. My mother turned first, and the fragile performance she'd been holding together all night finally cracked. "How could you embarrass me like that?" Her voice shook, not with sadness, but with something closer to fury. The fury of a woman watching a carefully constructed narrative collapse in front of the one audience she'd been trying hardest to impress. In front of a 4-star general, Olivia. You let that story— "I let him tell the truth," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I'd learned a long time ago that volume was rarely the most effective weapon in a room like this one. "That's all that happened tonight, Mom. Somebody told the truth at your table for once. Don't you dare— You want to talk about embarrassing? Something in me coiled tight for over a decade finally began to unspool, quiet and precise, each word landing where I meant it to land. "Let's talk about my promotion ceremony to captain, which you missed because it conflicted with your garden club luncheon. Let's talk about the phone call I made from a forward operating base in Kandahar on a satellite phone I had 11 minutes to use, and you told me you couldn't talk because you were choosing centerpieces for Emily's 16th birthday party. Let's talk about the fact that in this house there isn't a single photograph of me in 12 years, not one, while Dad's picture sits on that mantel like a shrine." My mother's mouth opened, closed. Emily had gone very quiet beside her, watching this happen the way you watch weather roll in, inevitable, no longer able to be stopped. "I didn't," my mother started. "You didn't ask," I said. "You never asked, not once. Not what I was doing, not whether I was safe, not what any of it cost me. You only ever asked whether I'd embarrass Emily, whether I'd embarrass you. I let that sit in the room for a moment, watching it land. Tonight, a stranger told you more about your own daughter than you've bothered to learn in a decade. My mother sat down heavily on the arm of the sofa, her hand pressed to her mouth, and for the first time all evening she looked less like a hostess and more like a woman confronting something she'd spent years successfully avoiding. She didn't have a response. I hadn't expected her to. Emily followed me upstairs a few minutes later. I heard her knock softly on my door, and when I opened it, her makeup had smudged beneath her eyes, her carefully done hair coming loose at the temples. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. She sat on the edge of my old bed, the same bed with the same faded quilt from when I was 17, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "I'm sorry," Emily said finally. "I should have known, I should have asked. I was so wrapped up in the wedding and Mom and making everyone happy that I never even wondered what you were actually doing all those years you were gone." "You were a kid, Em. It's not your job to manage Mom." "Neither is it yours." Her voice cracked slightly. "Olivia, there's something I never told you. 2 years ago, before Robert, I was seeing someone. His name was Daniel. He worked construction. He was kind. He made me laugh more than anyone ever has. Mom found out and told me he wasn't..." She made a small bitter gesture. "Wasn't the kind of man who belonged in this family. She made me break it off. She said if I didn't, she'd make sure everyone in her circle knew I'd thrown away my future on someone beneath us." I sat down beside her, something cold and clarifying settling into place. "She's done this before, to both of us, just in different ways." "I keep thinking about your uniform," Emily said quietly. "Growing up, Mom used to show your photo to her friends at the Women's League luncheons, bragging about you actually, your rank, your postings, all of it, but only when you weren't in the room. The second you walked through that door, you became the disappointment again." She looked at me, eyes wet. "I don't understand her, Olivia. I don't understand how she can be proud of you and ashamed of you at the exact same time." I understood it better than I wanted to admit. My mother's love had always been conditional on optics, on the story she could tell about her family, to people whose opinions she valued more than her own children's well-being. I was useful to her as an abstraction, a photograph passed around a luncheon table, and inconvenient to her as a person, someone who might say something honest, someone who didn't fit neatly into the frame she'd built. I didn't say any of that to Emily. Instead, I put my arm around her the way I used to when she was small and scared of thunderstorms, and let her cry quietly against my shoulder. But somewhere beneath the comfort I was offering her, something else had begun to take shape. Not rage. Rage was loud, and loud things could be managed, redirected, apologized away. What I felt instead was quieter than that, steadier, the same calm clarity I felt before executing a plan I'd already run through 100 times in my head. My mother had spent her whole life building a version of our family that served her image. Tonight, without meaning to, General Harrington had cracked that structure open. I didn't yet know exactly what came next, but I knew I wasn't going to let the cracks close back up quietly. The invitation arrived 2 weeks later, delivered not by mail but by a phone call from General Harrington's aide, requesting my presence, and pointedly my family's at a ceremony being held at Fort Belvoir. Officially, it was billed as a joint recognition event honoring several officers whose actions had, in the military's careful phrasing, materially altered the outcomes of classified operations. Unofficially, I understood within the first 30 seconds of the call exactly what General Harrington was doing. He was giving me a stage, and he was giving my mother a mirror. I almost said no. 7 years of declining recognition for Damascus hadn't been about modesty. It had been about protecting the operational details, protecting the people still working in that region, protecting the 2 names that would forever mean more to me than any medal ever could. But the security classification on the mission had been quietly downgraded 18 months earlier. Harrington's aide informed me, and the Army had been waiting for the right moment to formally acknowledge what happened. He hadn't orchestrated the timing to punish my mother. That much I believed. But he clearly hadn't discouraged it either. I called Emily first. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight with an excitement she was visibly trying to contain. "Mom's already talking about outfits," she said. "She thinks this is some kind of Pentagon social event. I don't think she understands what's actually happening." Does she know it's for me? A pause. She knows General Harrington invited us. I don't think she's put together the rest of it yet. My mother, when I called her, was indeed already several steps down the path of imagining herself photographed beside 4-star generals and their well-connected wives. "This is wonderful, Olivia," she said, her voice bright in a way that made something in my chest tighten. "This could be very good for Emily and Robert's engagement announcement. The Harringtons clearly think highly of this family." I let her have that. There was no version of the conversation where explaining the truth in advance would have served the purpose I was quietly building toward. Some lessons I had learned a long time ago land only when they arrive without warning. The morning of the ceremony was clear and cold, the kind of crisp autumn light that makes everything look sharper than it is. I wore my dress uniform for the first time in front of my family in longer than I could remember. The dark green jacket, the ribbons I rarely displayed, my hair pulled back with military precision. When I came downstairs, my mother glanced at me with faint surprise, as though she'd forgotten this version of me existed outside of photographs she showed to strangers. "You look very smart," she said in the tone she might have used for a stranger's daughter. Fort Belvoir's ceremonial hall was already filling with officers' families and a scattering of press when we arrived. My mother moved through the room with practiced social radar, seeking out familiar faces, angling herself toward conversations with wives of men whose rank she'd clearly researched in advance. Emily stayed close to me, quiet, watchful, the way she'd been ever since that night at the dinner table. The ceremony began with the usual formalities, the national anthem, opening remarks from a colonel I didn't know, a slideshow honoring several units. Then General Harrington took the podium and the room settled into a different kind of attention, the kind reserved for men whose words carry weight beyond the room they're spoken in. He spoke first about the broader mission in Syria 7 years earlier, the ambush, the losses, the operation's long classified silence. Then his voice shifted, steadied, and he said my name. Lieutenant Colonel Olivia Bennett. I stood and walked forward through a room that had gone very quiet, aware of every eye, aware most acutely of my mother's somewhere behind me in the crowd. Harrington described the events of that night in more detail than he had at the dinner table. The ambush, the burning vehicle, my decision to go back in for his communications officer, against every order to retreat, the 26 hours my team spent extracting 9 wounded soldiers under continued threat. He called it, without exaggeration in his voice, one of the most consequential acts of courage he'd witnessed in 31 years of service. Then, he opened the small case in his hands and I saw the silver star for the first time, not as an abstraction I'd been quietly avoiding for 7 years, but as a physical, unavoidable fact gleaming under the hall's lights. "It is my honor," Harrington said, "to finally formally recognize the officer who saved my life and 11 others. Lieutenant Colonel Bennett, one of the finest officers I have ever had the privilege of serving alongside." The applause that followed was not the polite ripple of a dinner party. It filled the hall, sustained, genuine officers rising from their seats. I stood at attention while Harrington pinned the medal to my uniform, his hand steady, his eyes meeting mine with something like quiet gratitude. And then, because I could not help it, because 7 years of silence had earned me at least this much, I let my gaze move past his shoulder out into the crowd and found my mother. She was standing very still, her hand pressed against her chest, her face drained of the practiced brightness she wore like armor. Around her, women she recognized from her social circles were turning, whispering, looking at her with new and unreadable expressions. For the first time in longer than I could remember, my mother had absolutely nothing to say. I held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough. Then I turned back to face the room and let the applause carry the moment forward out of her hands entirely. The photograph ran 3 days later above the fold in the Metro section of a Washington paper, and by the following Monday it had been picked up by a military affairs blog with considerable reach among the defense community. The headline was simple: Silver Star 7 years late, the officer who saved a general's life in Syria. The photograph showed me at attention, Harrington's hand steady on the medal at my chest, my face composed in the way I'd trained it to be for exactly this kind of moment. What the photograph didn't show, but the accompanying article described in careful detail, was the operational history behind it, the classification, the delay, the quiet courage that had gone unrecognized for the better part of a decade. I hadn't asked for the article. I later learned that a colonel who'd served alongside me in an earlier posting had spoken to the reporter unprompted, simply because he'd been waiting years for someone to tell the story properly. That was how these things worked sometimes. You spend so long protecting a silence that when it finally breaks, it breaks in directions you can't fully control. My mother's social world was not a large one in the grand scheme of Washington, but it was tightly woven, densely interconnected, the kind of circle where information traveled faster than any official channel. Within a week, she told me during a stiff, careful phone call, 3 separate women from her garden club had asked her with poorly disguised curiosity why she'd never mentioned that her daughter was a decorated Army officer who'd saved a 4-star general's life. One of them, apparently, had shown up at the garden club meeting with the newspaper clipping folded in her purse. "They're all asking questions I don't have good answers for," my mother said, and there was something in her voice I hadn't heard directed at me before. Not anger, not performance. Something closer to exposure. "Olivia, people are asking why you've never come to any of the events. Why there aren't photographs of you in the house. I don't know what to tell them." "Tell them the truth," I said. "I think you're getting good at that lately, whether you mean to or not." She didn't have a response to that. I let the silence sit rather than filling it for her the way I always used to. The unraveling when it came wasn't dramatic. It was the accumulation of small refusals. A woman my mother had known for 15 years declined an invitation to a luncheon my mother was hosting, citing a scheduling conflict that didn't hold up under scrutiny. Another simply stopped returning calls. My mother, I learned from Emily, had spent years positioning herself as a woman whose family reflected certain values: discipline, achievement, propriety, and now that same circle was quietly recalculating whether the story she'd told them matched the story that had actually been true all along. It wasn't cruelty on their part. It was simply the mechanics of a social world built on carefully curated narratives, and my mother had been caught telling one that didn't hold up. Emily called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice different than I'd heard it in years, clearer, steadier, less like a woman performing contentment, and more like someone genuinely searching for her own footing. "I told Robert I need to postpone the wedding," she said. I sat up straighter. "Emily." "Not canceled. Postponed. I need time, Olivia. I've spent my whole life doing what Mom wanted, marrying who she approved of, living inside a life she designed for me, because it was easier than fighting her. Watching what happened to you, watching Mom finally have to sit with the truth instead of managing it, it made me realize I don't actually know what I want. I've never once asked myself that question honestly." Her voice caught, then steadied again. "Robert understands. He's not going anywhere, but I need to figure out who I am without Mom's approval attached to it." Something in me eased slightly at that, some old worry I'd carried for my sister since she was a child, watching her get folded slowly into our mother's expectations the way I never had been, mostly because I'd left home young enough to escape the worst of it. "I'm proud of you," I told her, and meant it entirely. My mother came to my apartment the following weekend, unannounced, which was itself unusual enough that I nearly didn't recognize her at first through the peephole, not because her appearance had changed, but because the posture had. She stood in my doorway without the practiced composure she usually wore, like a second uniform, her hands twisting together in front of her. "May I come in?" I let her in. She sat on the edge of my couch, looking around my small apartment with its sparse, functional furniture, the framed photograph on my bookshelf of my unit in Syria, faces I would never explain to her, because some things belonged to people who'd earned the right to know them. "I don't know how to fix this," she said finally, and her voice for the first time in my adult life had no performance in it at all. "The women I've known for 15 years are treating me like a stranger. Emily's postponed her wedding, and I keep replaying that dinner, replaying years of dinners, and I don't—" She stopped, pressed her fingers against her eyes. "I don't know how I became a person who introduced her own daughter as a disappointment. I didn't rush to comfort her. Some part of me, the part that had spent 12 years absorbing that exact sentence, needed her to sit inside the discomfort a little longer before I offered anything close to relief. "You taught me that reputation mattered more than anything else," I said finally quietly. "More than truth. More than the people actually in front of you. So today, Mom, I think you should live inside your real reputation for a while. Not the one you built, the one that's actually true. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, tears finally slipping free, and for the first time in longer than either of us could probably measure. My mother looked like a woman confronting herself honestly, instead of managing how she appeared to everyone else in the room. 3 months passed, the way transitions do when you're not paying close attention to the calendar, not in dramatic turns, but in small, steady accumulations. I was reassigned that winter, a new post with expanded responsibility, the kind of assignment that would have been unimaginable to explain to my mother in the years when she thought the military was something to apologize for at dinner parties. I packed my apartment in Alexandria over a single weekend, methodical the way I approached everything, and drove south toward my new posting with the small case containing my silver star tucked carefully among boxes of books and uniforms. Emily called while I was still unpacking, her voice full of an energy I hadn't heard from her in years. She'd enrolled in graduate courses in social work, finishing the degree she'd abandoned years earlier when our mother decided it wasn't a practical enough path for a Bennett daughter. On weekends, she'd started volunteering at a veterans transition center outside D.C., helping former service members navigate the maze of benefits and paperwork that waited for them after their service ended. She told me about a Marine she'd worked with that week, a man in his 50s, readjusting to civilian life after 2 decades, and there was something in the way she described his gratitude that told me she'd found work that mattered to her in a way nothing had before. "I keep thinking about what you went through," she told me during one call, and I realized I never actually understood what any of it meant until I started meeting people who lived it too. "I used to just think of your service as this abstract thing Mom was embarrassed about. Now I understand what I was actually dismissing." Robert, she told me, had been steady through all of it, not pushing her toward a wedding date, not treating her postponement as rejection, simply giving her room to become whoever she was becoming. I liked him considerably more for that patience than I had at the dinner table months earlier. My mother, for her part, had grown quieter. Not transformed. I didn't expect transformation, and I'm not certain I would have trusted it if it had arrived too quickly or too completely, but quieter, more careful, less inclined to perform for rooms that no longer applauded the performance. The garden club luncheons had thinned considerably, several of her oldest friendships, never fully recovering from the exposure of that autumn. She'd stopped attending some events altogether, Emily told me, choosing instead to spend her time in smaller, less curated ways, gardening mostly, and a weekly lunch with one friend who'd stayed loyal through the unraveling. She texted me occasionally, short messages, nothing elaborate, asking how the new post was, whether I'd settled in, once sending a photograph of a rose garden she was particularly proud of. I answered when I could, politely, sometimes warmly, but I kept a distance I wasn't yet ready to close entirely. Forgiveness, I'd come to understand, wasn't a single decision made in a doorway. It was something built slowly, in small, verifiable increments, and I intended to let her earn every one of them rather than handing them over out of old habit. She called me once in February on the anniversary of my father's death. Her voice was different on that call, unguarded in a way I still wasn't fully used to. She told me she'd been going through old boxes in the attic and found photographs from my basic training graduation photographs. She admitted she'd never actually looked at closely before, tucked them away, instead of displaying them, because some part of her, even then, hadn't known how to reconcile the daughter in the photograph with the daughter she thought she wanted. "I'm framing one," she told me, "for the mantle, if that's all right with you." I sat with that for a long moment before answering. "That's all right with me, Mom." It wasn't everything. It wasn't a full accounting for 12 years of missed calls and skipped ceremonies, and a lifetime of being introduced as a disappointment at her own dinner table. But it was something true, offered without an audience to perform for, and I'd learned enough in my career to recognize the value of small, honest movements in the right direction. On a clear evening in early spring, I found myself standing alone on the rooftop terrace of the officers' quarters at my new post, the sun dropping low and gold over the tree line, the base settling into its evening quiet around me. I'd taken the small case out of my desk drawer that afternoon, unsure exactly why, and now I stood turning it over in my hands, watching the last light catch against the metal of the silver star inside. I thought about the girl who'd once stood in front of a mirror in her childhood bedroom, wearing a uniform her own mother couldn't bring herself to be proud of out loud. I thought about the woman who'd sat through a dinner where her own name was used as a punchline. I thought about all the years I'd spent believing that if I just achieved enough, sacrificed enough, proved myself enough times in rooms far more dangerous than any dining room, eventually the story my mother told about me would change. It hadn't been my achievements that changed anything in the end. It had been the truth arriving on its own schedule in a room I hadn't engineered, spoken by a man who had no reason to soften it for anyone's comfort. My mother once called me the family's biggest disappointment. Tonight, standing in the fading light with the weight of that medal in my palm, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself believe before I was no longer trying to outrun that sentence. I was simply Olivia Bennett. And for the first time in my life, that was enough, not because anyone else had finally said so, but because I had. If this story moved you, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop it in the comments below. We have new stories like this one waiting for you every single day, so subscribe and stay close, because this journey is only just getting started.